What's going on, beautiful J4 community? Hope you're enjoying your Sunday, that you did your ritual, your coffee, your house cleaning, whatever it is. Thank you all so much, so much, so much for joining me in. It's been a minute since I posted, been taking care of some business like everyone else. But I did want to get on here. This morning, I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to share with the beautiful community, and it kind of hit me this intergenerational divide or nuance between biracials of my era. I was born in 1968 in terms of identity formation versus someone perhaps born in 1990, 2000, something like that. And so I began to think about it. And so I've come up with this topic today: biracial identity and proximity to blackness, law, location, and leverage. So let me give you a little context. So Gene and I did a presentation called White Mothers and Their Biracial Black Sons. And unbeknownst to us, this thing went at least viral for our vantage point, has over 34,000 views. It was exciting to see some of the energy traditionally and continuously. This is a parent focused page that has now shifted to parenting Black and biracial children. But this one particular video, and I think it was the biracial Black component that drew attention to it, really had a lot of focus and attention, and it was eye opening for me. We shared our journey as biracial kids born to white mothers and Black fathers, and kind of our seeking out, as all young people do, a community, a social network. And for us, we pathwayed into a Blackness. That was our journey. That was kind of heavily influenced the kind of life and human beings we are today. And yet, I discovered this chat session was on fire. The comment section was on fire. And in there, I discovered a couple of things that were just unbeknownst to me. I had not been attuned to it, was not connected to it. Is that a significant number of the commenters were saying or arguing essentially that that biracial kids were not Black. Man, and that was like, what? Tripped me out. It had not been my worldview. All my biracial friends in my age set kind of recognized biracialness racially, but culturally they kind of identified as Black, and that was just normalized for us. But yet here in the 2022 had huge numbers of comments from beautiful Black folks saying biracial kids were not Black, not even culturally, right? And so that tripped me out. And then a little bit more energy, a little bit more comments, and then I started hearing from biracial folks who they themselves were also essentially saying that they were not Black. Logically, I understand this, but culturally, it was amazing, fascinating to me. And so ever since then, I kind of been in this space of exploring biracial identity, both from a parenting perspective, but also from sort of an anthropological kind of assessment, because there is this insurgence, there's this agency declaration that's going on from certain small pockets of the biracial community to declare its own identity. This is fascinating to me. I absolutely did not know that it existed. And so today I want to explore why, at least from my lens, from my own musings, from my own thinking. Why? Why do we have one generation who pathwayed, with certain nuance and struggle, but pathwayed into a Blackness, so unquestionably? And then why a generation or two later, the young folks are choosing different kinds of pathways, different kinds of identity declarations, ways of being, ways of asserting themselves. And I responded to this through a video called Are Mixed Kids Still Black? And essentially, I outlined 9 criteria that I think would need to be in place for the question to even have legs to it, to even have sort of a foundation towards an individual identity. But today I want to talk about why. Where has the generational disconnect occurred from biracial folks in my era and then young people born today who are biracial, largely speaking from a Black-white configuration? And what's going on with their minds? What's going on with their identity formation? How are they finding ways into communities? What are those experiences like? And how is it sort of having them land in this new space where they're wanting to sort of break away from an historical maternal Blackness and move into somewhat of their own identity? So that's kind of the premise of today. Thank you guys for joining me so much. Truly appreciate you here. If you have questions or comments at any time, feel free to throw them in. I'm going to be talking about sort of a pre-modern era. I'm using the 60s, the decade of the 60s, which was a very amazing decade. I think in the chronicles of history, especially within the United States, the 1960s would really be a pivotal decade on all things racial, political, educational, war, all those kinds of things. So when I say the modern era, just for your referencing of kind of what I'm thinking, the modern era is 60s decade and forward, and then the pre-modern era would be 60s kind of on back, but also we're contextualizing this within a racialized United States of America. So biracial folks have been around for a while. They have different kind of names: mulatto, quadroon, octroon, all those kind of things. So the phenomena of biracial kids or mixed kids is not a new phenomenon, but the identity dynamics that I'm hearing today, beautiful family, that is new. That is new. So I'm learning a lot in this space. It's been truly enlightening for me. And one of the things that I'm discovering is that while we're having a conversation today, largely shaped by countless young people who were refusing to only lift up one love source, but particularly around the 2000 census, through the people's will, through a democratic process and lobbying effort, they're saying, no, we want to have the capacity to identify as two or more races, which I believe was a gesture to both paternal love sources in terms of recognizing that they are both. To where in my generation, we recognized and knew literally that we were both, but we tended to silence our white mother's voices or the white parent voice to the uplift of the black parent voice. And that was a part of our membership seeking process. One can arguably say that that was cowardly or wrong, but it was the reality of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds trying to navigate public spaces and social membership. So if you look at the sort of a pre-modern era, pre-1960s, and you're thinking about folks who are biracial, multi-generationally mixed, whatever the case may be, and they're seeking to be a part of a community or they're just blindly in a community, there's a number of things that are at play that, in my opinion, made that being a part of Black membership in pre-60s kind of era within that decade just sort of the natural, coherent, logical thing to do. And I'm making a distinction a little bit later that there's been significant change and progress on certain kind of racialized fronts that has reshifted or reoriented or reworded the question of identity, particularly for biracial communities. So first thing I want to acknowledge is that there was a small yet distinct group of mulatto or free persons of color communities, particularly in the pockets of the South. So when we talk about biracial identity, it's not just the narrative of white master historically impregnating Black women for property growth and acquisition. It's not just that. That was a very significant part of the creation of mixed race kids, but given the Creole culture, the Gullah Geechee culture, there were communities that require more study and research on my part. In fact, I just recently purchased a book called Free People of Color. I need to read that and understand kind of its origins and its history and its trajectory here in the United States of America. So I acknowledge that despite antebellum chattel enslavement, 1619 up until 1863, followed by a brief period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and segregation into the mid-60s, that there were free persons of color or mulatto designation. Literally, it was on the census at some point in time. So I acknowledge that. However, something comes along for sort of white control and dominance called the one drop rule. And what that does is it serves to cluster everyone in terms of a grouping. And when I say everyone, anyone who reflects any kind of outward appearance of having some blackness in them via the one drop rule and all of its complexities, problems, whatever the case may be. This is not a conversation about the one drop rule, but what it does do is legally and as a social construct, it puts any person of color with any hint or hue of color into the same common grouping, all right? Or even if you were white passing but someone knew your family heritage and had blackness in it, then by virtue of someone sort of diming you out, you would be considered and treated accordingly as a member of a non-white group, and in this case, a collective massive blackness. This is the pre-modern era of 1960s. One drop rule clusters everyone in terms of grouping. All right. Grouping doesn't necessarily convey culture, but as time goes by, history unveils itself, incidents occur, people respond to it, they react to it, they fight against it, and out of this, some massive loose cultural community kind of comes about, which includes Black monolithic folk and some configuration of mixed heritage people. The one drop rule does that. In all of its complexity and problems, that's what it does. It makes everyone cluster in terms of a common grouping. All right. Then we have Jim Crow. This is basically the enforcement of segregation in a post-chattel enslavement world. And so Jim Crow clusters everyone in terms of location. And this is what we call segregation. One portion of a community has to live in certain geographical spaces, and there's rules of interfacing across different cultural communities. This is the case in the South aggressively, but also not to exclude, this is also the pattern of living arrangements in the North. Jim Crow, i.e. civil rights, i.e. black codes, it clusters everyone in terms of location. One drop rule clusters everyone in terms of group. Jim Crow clusters everyone in terms of location. Now, through the resiliency of the ancestors and the living elders, civil rights was the response to segregation, that the people were not a passive community, that they were always resisting and fighting in different kind of ways for their human dignity, for their cultural uplift, for their freedoms, both at local levels and also through federal legislation. Civil rights clusters everyone in terms of a national cultural agenda. Civil rights clusters everyone as a national cultural agenda, and the priority is to assert the 14th Amendment, to put forth civil rights legislation to protect human beings from discrimination, from death, from threat, from violence, from being able to be mobile and to move about in public accommodation, in public kind of spaces, to have the right to vote, these kind of things. The civil rights in response to segregation becomes the national cultural agenda, and this bonds the people. This bonds the people. Let me pause right here and acknowledge Magic Mulata. How are you? Good to see you. Hope you are doing very well on this Sunday. Thank you all for joining me, and especially Magic Mulata. Truly appreciate you here. I'm exploring a conversation between the generational dynamics when it comes to biracial identity, as I understood it as someone born in the 60s versus how someone moves through it, navigates it, thinks about it, decides who they are culturally, if they were born in 2000, 1990s, whatever the case may be. And so it's a fascinating juxtaposition intergenerationally that I'm examining. The question of biracial identity to me did not exist in any pronounced, aggressive, affirmed kind of way prior to 1960 because of these factors. The one drop rule clustered people by groups. The Jim Crow clustered people by location in terms of where you live, where you couldn't move, what you had to do. And then also the response to Jim Crow, civil rights created a national agenda. It created a national cultural agenda that bonded the people. All right. Now, civil rights clusters everyone in terms of a national cultural agenda, and the leaders of the time to include monolithically black men and women, but to also include mixed kids, to also include mixed men and women who, if you just look back in the chronicles of history, you will see notable civil rights leaders and heroes across gender, although it leaned consistent with the time, primarily men. But you will also see an ample amount of historical figures who are monolithically black, but also who clearly have some whiteness in their immediate heritage or somewhere in the generations back. Okay. All right. Magic Milan is calling me an elder, y'all. That's a nice way of saying old. All right. The internet changed the game the most, I think. You're absolutely right, and I will reference that in a moment. All right. So the question of colorism, or are you black or are you not black, was the furthest thing from a legitimate question when you are dealing with law, you're dealing with external threat, you're dealing with lynchings, you're dealing with high vulnerability. Your priority is much bigger than whether or not your cousin is actually Black or not. It is much bigger than that. And the pressing agenda of the time for Black folk and biracial folk was their freedom, was to be not subject to discriminatory law. This was the galvanizing glue of Blackness and biracialness at the time. And so, because it was because most activism in the 60s required mass amounts of people for boycott processes, to sort of test different kind of laws, freedom rides, whatever those cases may be, the movement needed people, all right? And so they weren't quibbling about how much Black you got in you and who's your granddaddy and whiteness. No, they weren't quibbling about that. They needed people, they needed bodies, they needed activists, right? The national priority was their freedom. And so they needed leverage and they needed people. And there was an emphasis on numbers and there was an emphasis on communalism, to bond, to come together to fight a common cause. All right. So the notion of identity made no sense at that particular time. And you did not have this, you're not Black, I'm biracial kind of thing. You didn't have those conversations that we're seeing today, in large part because the pre-modern era of the 60s dealt with very stringent realities that were enforced by police and backed up by law. They were dealing with vicious racism. And so questions around identity are not salient when you're dealing with that level of tension and stress and threat. All right. Plus, there's also another interesting dynamic, is that the admixture. I'm learning a new word. The admixture, meaning where does the racial mix come from? Prior to the 60s, that was largely coming from white men. White men. At the time, whiteness was considered a nemesis. Whiteness was associated with white supremacy. So this dynamic of acknowledging my duality or all of my heritage kind of makeup, no one at that particular time, I'm generalizing here, were sort of wanting to associate or advocate with a white nemesis, with white supremacy, with vitriol coming from white mouths and voices. And so this recognition of the duality and the truth in your birth heritage was not something that was aggressively or excitingly explored, because you were dealing with a cultural national agenda seeking freedom, and that was not the time nor era nor the proximity to then talk about the DNA diversity, not DNA, but the cultural heritage diversity that you have. So let me pause there. Right? People were not worried about colorism when the KKK was killing people. Boom. Boom. People ain't worried about colorism when the KKK is killing people. That's dope. That's dope, Magic. Most people gladly stepped up to fight for Black rights, right? Not only did they step up for fight for Black rights, but they consider themselves Black. They recognize hue difference. A person sees racial differences at 3 years old. They recognized it, but they saw themselves of it. It was their birthright, right? All right. So the admixture was largely white men, and whiteness at the time was certainly not something that one was, eager to claim, explore, and legitimize. So in this process, colorism is distantly secondary. I don't even think it's on the agenda, right? This results in a coherent cultural solidarity. It might have been created from a nefarious one-drop rule, but it has the positive outcome of creating an important cultural coherent solidarity to fight against threat and legal discrimination, and in some cases, loss of life and limb. It becomes necessary. It's a positive outcome to create a coherent cultural solidarity. All right. Well, the magic up in here. Crazy how it flipped. Most biracials used to be all from white men. Black women nowadays, most biracials are from Black men and white women. Yes, and there is a reason for that. Mulatto, what's good, brother? Mulatto Vanguard in the house. Respect to the stream. Good to see you, Mulatto. We got Magic Mulatto in here. So I'm basically talking about in fact, Mulatto, it was you that often said that it's your generation, it was different. in your generation, it was different. I had to sort of set with that, right? I had to set with that a little bit. But now today, I'm trying to explore why it was different. And to me, it has something to do with perhaps the most seminal decade in the entirety of the 20th century, if not all of 100 years of 500 years of America, the 1960s. I'm calling that the decade that is a transition from a pre-modern era to a modern era. The modern era is the 60 decades kind of going forward. But the reality of blackness at that time, established through the one drop rule, then Jim Crow creating segregation spaces that people were clustered together by way of location, and there was no escaping that in any mass amounts of numbers. And then the fact that the civil rights became the national cultural agenda item of priority, and that people and bodies were needed, that one didn't quibble about identity. If you were down for the cause, you were down for the culture, you were part of it, and it was undeniable, that was unquestionable. And then the admixture dynamic that wasn't largely ran to and glorified because it was white men producing most of the mixed heritage over the decades prior to the 60s. And at that time, whiteness was a nemesis, certainly a representational threat to the collective Black advancement. And the notion of colorism or quibbling about racial content, melanin content, was so far off the agenda, and that were resulting in a coherent cultural solidarity. All right, so that's the modern era, and the reality of which I was born into. It was the reality of which my father talked to me and raised me and put a certain premium on culturalness, particularly of blackness. And it was certainly the space that was the tone and the tenor of my age set when I was in public educational environments trying to navigate social membership, as all young people do. All right. We 90 babies all over the internet. They said mixed people are not black, so we had to accept that. Yeah. And I discovered that in the video. Me and Gene were just musing on, growing up biracial in the 70s and early 80s. And then all of a sudden the comment section was on fire. I mean, blew up. And black folks saying, y'all ain't black. I said, what? And then, I researched it a little bit, and then biracial folks were saying, all right, well, then we ain't black, and talking about creating new identities. And this is just fascinating for me. And so this is kind of what today is exploring. Generational nuance. I'm a millennial. Yep, definitely generational nuance. So let's talk about it. Following the 60s, the decade of the 60s, you have largely through legislation of the 60s, things change. Things change, or to say it differently, congratulations and thank you to ancestors, both Black and biracial, multiracial, whatever the case may be, and white allies. America put a mirror to itself, and begrudgingly or problematically or whatever it is, it initiated legislation that enforced the Constitution by the denial of federal dollars. And that decade recognizes and symbolizes a major change, at least legally. It takes time for attitudes to change, and people are still sort of thwarting and undercutting legislation. It just doesn't magically change because a law gets passed, but very bold acts are passed in the mid-60s to include civil rights legislation, which forbids discrimination on the basis of sex, as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. So there's recourse, you can redress it. The act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. You could go to the movies, you could sit in a restaurant, you could ride the bus, and federally funded programs. Meaning if your public institution had any federal dollars, of which large numbers of states have commingled federal dollars, then you had to adhere to constitutional laws and amendments, and that you could be denied dollars and therefore check yourself and make you behave accordingly. And it also strengthened the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act and the desegregation of schools. That was a seminal act and outcome of the civil rights movement, which was a direct result of the work of Black and biracial ancestors. All right. The other one was the Fair Housing Act, which is now challenging segregation in terms of living accommodation in a very direct kind of way, which forbids housing discriminations. Housing discrimination is still one of the lingering vestiges in a modern time of discriminatory practices, not only in the form of redlining, but in appraisal of homes, white flight, all those kinds of things. So that is still a holdout and a vestiges of the 60s. But now you have some recourse that should you discover or feel or research or have a case of discrimination, you can file and get some kind of recourse, at least at a legal kind of level. And then the Higher Education Act. The Higher Education Act of the mid 60s introduces financial aid. Now college is there's a way to pay for college. Historically, you had to have academic acumen and the capacity to pay for it. Now that financial aid comes in, people can get loans, grants to help supplement the cost of education, and you see a tremendous bump in the diversification of higher education, not only at historically Black colleges and universities, but also at predominantly white institutions. And now you have a different kind of Black proximity to traditionally white spaces. Before, biracial people, by way of birth and segregation, their proximity, their community, their extended family was in segregated locations in space, in geographical clusters, right? That was enforced through law. Now, with the Civil Rights banning discrimination, Fair Housing Act banning housing discrimination, Higher Education Act providing financial support for college, you begin to see the proximity of Black and biracial not being to just each other, but now it is moving outward into traditional spaces where Black and biracial folks did not have as much presence. And so the Black proximity in traditionally white spaces increases, largely in colleges, largely moving from rural communities to urban centers and corridors. The military draft plays a part in this, where you have GIs, enlisted men who are going to the military. They're traveling throughout the world and they're meeting women from other kinds of communities and cultures and countries, which was my journey. That's how I came into the world. My dad enlisted in 1962. First assignment was France. He meets my mother in France. They come back to the United States in 66. They're married in France, come back in 66. I'm born in 1968. So the military traveling the world, meeting women from different countries is also something new that's coming from the draft. And professional spaces are starting to diversify largely around integration and then to some extent a little bit later, affirmative action. So you go from rigid racialized segregation out of the 60s into some form of integration, which has its own debate and argument, particularly around cultural solidarity. But now you have this mixture of human beings who historically were rigidly distanced from each other for a host of different reasons. And when you put human beings in proximity to each other, these human beings will explore each other. And once they get past cordialities and low levels of disclosure and exotification, eventually they get to, hey, how you doing? What's your name? Would you like to hang out with me? And then that parlays into a host of different things. The percentage of interracial marriages in 1967 was 3%. 3%. Today it is 17%. 17%. The percentage of biracial babies in 1970 was 1%. 1%. Today it is 10% or 33.8 million people. This does not happen randomly. This happens because of societal change reflected upon and examined through a historical lens. The 60s changed the proximity from biracial Blackness to each other exclusively to now Black and biracial kids moving out into the broader sphere, populace and public. And in doing so, they intermingle, they exchange, they discover each other, and you have this explosion of interracial marriages and hence biracial babies who are asking different questions with different options today for a host of different reasons. For a host of different reasons. Let me pause there. Thank you all who are in the box. Love to know who's in here. Get a shout out. Great info. Thank you, Magic Mulata. You're going to head out. Enjoy your Sunday. If y'all have questions, this will be the time to throw it in it, because now I'm going to talk about today's era, today's generation, which is the current manifestation that began at the beginning of the modern era, which is the decade of the 60s. The decade of the 60s. All right. So the first question we have to ask ourselves, we don't have to do anything, but I'd like to ask ourselves, is the cultural continuity, the cohesion between Black and biracial, Are the circumstances the same today as they were in the 60s? Are the same circumstances in place today that created cultural cohesion in the 60s? Is that still present today? It is not. It is not. And that is in part because the cultural national agenda is no longer as strong or as large as it was when people were fighting for discrimination based upon birth circumstances. The discrimination they were feeling and dealing with and having to fight against was not a condition of behavior, it was a condition of birth. They simply were discriminated against because they were Black or had some evidence of Black in them. That does not exist today, where a person is fighting a legal law, something that is protected by the courts, that is based upon a person's birth. Now it is mostly around behavior, all right? So let me get in there. We got Malata. I don't see where there ever really unity. Eartha Kitt talks about it. Okay. I'm not saying there wasn't tension or nuance of colorism, but it was certainly not a dominant identity of which I'm seeing it emerge as today. All right. So activism or the cultural agenda is no longer directed towards the Constitution. It's no longer directed towards the Constitution. It is now so more directed towards identity politics, incidents, and institutions. Think George Floyd, think the banter and debate we have going on around gender identity and sexual orientation, those kind of things. So activism as a collective is no longer based on the Constitution. It's more so to identity politics, incidents, and institution. Think institutionalized racism, that kind of stuff, right? So the need for numbers and large amounts of people, the leverage, the glue of culture in the past, is no longer as dominant because the strategy of boycotting is not something that we're doing today. It is more protest. It is more addressing legality. It is more seeking amends from decision makers at colleges and in the political sphere. So this notion of massive boycotting, which requires mass amounts of people to do something or to not do something, the question of numbers or i.e. leverage is no longer a dominant strategy of activism in a modern era, all right? So this notion of I need bodies, and we're not going to quibble about who those bodies are, that question is not consistent with the modern era of activism and protest. And so the leveraging of numbers is no longer critical. So now we see a fissure. We see a difference between 60s identity dynamics and today's context by which it might be in play, right? We also see a blurring of rigid racial lines through the youth. We see a blurring of the rigid racial lines between the youth. Back when I was born in the military environment, you had a certain kind of intermingling among diversity because diversity is controlled a little bit more, or racial behavior is controlled in the military environment when your parents' job is tied to their behavior. But in the broader society, 70s, you typically had still lingering segregation in terms of neighborhoods, and kids and families tended to cluster kind of together. But it was nothing like the kind of intermingling in social settings, K-12 environments, or sports and activities. You see this diminishing of rigid racial clustering, particularly in young people, and so you have a blurring of rigid racial lines in the youth. You have a blurring of rigid racial lines in the youth in a modern era. And then to Mulata's point, you have the advent of the internet. You have the advent in the internet. So now you're rearranging proximity at a grandeur global level. Before you had to deal with people in person, and there's a certain way of you in which you deal with each other. There's a certain civility, a certain kind of social contract you have when you have to live, wake up, go to sleep, and manage a life in close proximity to people, right? You hold your tongue, you're a little bit more acquiesced, you're a little bit more empathetic, a little bit more considerate, right? But when you enter in this technological advent of the internet, now all of a sudden proximity is no longer geographical physically, it is now technologically, and that is something that didn't exist in the 60s. And while the internet is a beautiful thing, it also brings out a different part of the human personality. a person would do things that they would not do if they were in direct proximity to a person physically, right? It creates a different kind of phenom. It lets out a different kind of character trait of an individual, which is huge in terms of the conversation we're having. Now, you also have young people dominating the public space of conversation. In the past, you had an older generation that would dominate at least the direction of the broader conversation. Now, through the advent of technology and young people's comfort with it, as opposed to an older generation, young people are dominating the public space of conversation around group membership, access, and privilege. It is young people who are now determining group membership, access, and privilege. And they're doing it without the watchful guiding eye of an older generation. Back in the day, if you had two kids who were bumping up and kind of going at each other around something like identity and who are you and you're not black and you're a white boy, whatever the case may be, parents could come in and they could monitor that. They could teach to that. They could educate. They could have family conversations, right? But now, I don't know to what extent parents are watching what's going on in these YouTube streets. I don't know if there's any checks and balances between old and young. I would tend to think that there isn't any, and so you have a person who is still developing their worldview and their sense of self with a certain level of understanding and awareness in broad themes, and they're also largely consistent with their age. They're emotional, and their reputation is highly important to them, and they're just on fire. They're just on fire, right? That's now in the scene, right? But it is young people who are now controlling membership, conversation topics, access, and the distribution of privilege or the distribution of power, right? And largely the conversation in these spaces are around relationships, men and female. That's blowing up in the space. It's around sexual orientation, LGBTQIA, right? Trans conversation is blowing up in this space. Gender identity, which is tied to some extent to a trans identity, that's blowing up in this space. And in terms of the Black dynamic, colorism is starting to resurface itself in both ways. Colorism is starting to resurface itself in both ways because there isn't this commonality of location. There's no longer this commonality of a national agenda. There's no longer this aggressive threat based upon a birth inheritance or a birthness, right? And when you take away these very real high arching life and death dominant things, people then drop down and they begin to quabble and grapple around lesser issues. And right now, it's kind of bubbling up, but you're having this tension primarily in young, youthful spaces around colorism. And all this is resulting in a disjointed cultural solidarity. This is resulting in a disjointed cultural solidarity. It is not like it was in the 60s for reasons I just kind of outlined. In an absence of a cohesive cultural solidarity, there becomes fissures, there becomes cracks, cultural cracks. And in this process, the biracial community is kind of wiggling out. It's wiggling out. It's beginning to explore and express itself from a sense of agency and identity. And it's doing so because of perceptions of how they are embraced or have membership in monolithic Black spaces, young Black folks who are perhaps going through their own social identity formation, which has a lot to do with reputation, attraction, how they're feared among their peer groups, right? And so they look outwardly and they have some opinion about people of lighter hue. People of lighter hue have some opinion about Blackness, right? And so we got this quasi-internal civil war going on between young people who don't communicate with solution in mind. They communicate with reputation in mind. And if they feel attacked, they go all out. They go all out. And the circumstances of today's set of nuances that young people are dealing with is because of the great and good work of the ancestors and elders who solved a major problem, which was America, live up to your Constitution. But in the aftermath of that, 50 some years later or two generations, you now have the inheritors of great racial work, great evidence of Black and biracial unity in the 60s. But now the very thing that brought them together fighting for liberty, racial uplift, and human decency, those questions are no longer present because the problem had been solved, and now we're spinning in a modern time. And because we no longer have a dominant external nemesis, we're coming at ourselves. We're coming at ourselves. And in this fissure, in this cracking, this widening, biracial folks are wiggling out. They're wiggling out, and they're exploring new conversations and new identities. All right, that's what I wanted to share. I see a couple of folks in here. I'd love to have your disagreements. I'd love to have your questions. I'd love if something hit a thread with you and you want to process it a little bit more. I'll stay on just a little bit. I'm going to get the invite here. Drop the comment. All right, we are in a question and comment phase. If you do come up, I'd like you to speak about the content that you might have. The content, questions about the content or comments. And then if you want to go off subject, we can do that. But if you do come up first, speak to the dynamic of the presentation, which was my generation had a different set of questions about cultural membership than today's generations. And it was largely rooted in the 60s era as what I'm calling the dividing decade between the pre-modern era and a postmodern era, particularly in the conversation around identity or biracial identity, is because the 60s initiated several seminal legislative acts that changed the proximity of people from predominantly, if you had any color in you, you were relegated to certain kind of spaces. Because of legislation in the mid 60s, you then changed your proximity to not just biracial and Black folks, but then you go out into the broader sphere, and we see America mingling and interacting more. And when you mingle and interact, you minimize myths and stereotypes, and you elevate and maximize discovery of human personality and humanity. And then certain sectors of that society will explore it even further, and they'll enter into amorous kinds of love and relationships, producing children, as is evidenced by the data. In 1967, 3% of marriages were interracial. Today it's 17%, if not higher. Percentage of biracial children was 1% in 1970. Today it is 10%. And by all indications, that trajectory is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. Of all interracial constructs, the only one that is declining is Asian and other. Asian and other are no longer going up at an exponential rate, but all other mixes, Black, white, Native, Asian, Latino, whatever, all other configurations of interracial marriages are going up. And so it would suggest that interracial marriages are going to increase, hence more biracial children are going to be born. And as families and parents raising these biracial children, you're going to have some questions, hopefully before you birth them, how you're going to raise them in terms of an identity dynamic. The question was unasked in my time. I was going to figure out how to be Black. But today's generation has a different kind of different options to consider. But parents, as the steward of youth identity up to a particular age, you're the ones that will set in motion what they're exposed to, where they live, what schools they go to, what they know about both beautiful communities, and how they then set in a comfort identity that will be forever changing, that because they are of a particular heritage configuration that their parents are not, right? Parents will speak from their understanding of culture. One parent will speak from their understanding of culture, but they're speaking to someone that represents both cultures. And the parents don't have that configuration unless they themselves are biracial or multi-generational. And so today, perhaps now more than ever, you have to have constructive ways of raising children with a particular mindfulness that biracial children, multi-generational children have a reality that monolithic children don't have. And it is something that you cannot avoid, and would be, I think, would benefit the child from a healthy sense of esteem if there's constructive and deliberate ways of raising the beautiful baby age appropriate, with also a mindfulness of identity formation, which is critical to a sense of esteem and belonging, that there has to be some strategy and redress of that that accounts for the beautiful cultural communities from which they come. All right. I'm not seeing anyone interested in coming up in the boxes. This is a conversation for parents raising Black and biracial children. There's plenty of other content that emphasizes the biracial space and also broader themes around just parenting. Please check out one of the videos here. And if you like the content, it helps us if you share and subscribe and tell some folks raising beautiful biracial children, hey, that if they want a sounding board or perspective, come on over to J4 Conversations. All right. Thank you guys for joining me on a Sunday. Love, love, love.